So welcome back. After you've played around in Adobe Bridge, we're going to jump to Camera Raw. So even if you are using JPEGs, for this tutorial we are really going to emphasize that you use these DNG files, which are digital negative, which is Camera Raw. In the future, if you want to do these edits on a JPEG, you're more than welcome to. It just you won't have the full dynamic range. So let's find one we can do some work on. Alright, so you can, if you're on a Mac, you can just hit spacebar to preview. This one's a little overexposed. That one's not so great. I'm trying to find one that has quite a bit of detail and we can make it sing. Highlights are a little tricky because sometimes there's not a lot of information. If something's underexposed, you can pull some information out. So I'm going to play around with this boat. So you can right-click, open in Camera Raw, and it'll open up a program called Camera Raw. It's sort of a program within a program. And I'm just going to click and drag and make it nice and big. Alright, so this is Camera Raw. And you have all sorts of information. You have sort of the things you can edit over here. You have your histogram, some of your information over here, and some tools up here. You have your zoom, your hand, and some other things that we will talk about. So I like to start off with getting a good exposure and color correction first off. I find that starting off with pulling the color out is a good way to start for adjusting exposure. So historically, depending on which version you have, if you're following the PDF, you may have to kind of click on the HSL and there's a convert for grayscale. This is shown within within the details in the PDF. I have a newer version, so I can just click black and white, so keep that in mind. This is going to take the color out so we're not sort of confused by the colors. The next thing we're going to do is, this is our histogram, which if you did the exposure lectures already, this is familiar. So we have our blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites. We have these two little ink drop dudes, and we're going to click and select them. These are called our clipping wordings, where things are clipped. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to take my exposure over here. So anywhere where that's blue says there's no detail, that is pure black. Anywhere where it says where it's red means it's clipped, that is pure white. So this is dependent on whatever image you chose. And I like to put that on so you know for sure that something is completely blown out. This is a very gray and like muddy image. And we're going to try to make it sing with using Camera Raw processes. And if you're shooting with JPEG, it's 8 bits of information. So there's only so much. RAW has 16 bits of information. This has 8 bits, so we have to keep that in mind. So we have our exposure, contrast, highlight, shadow, black, and white sliders. So these are very simple. They're sliders. You can click auto to see this is what it determines to be the best. But you don't want to let a computer figure it out for you. You're smarter than a computer. So you can adjust exposure left to kind of take it darker, white. And this is sort of overall brightness. So I'm looking at my histogram. It's kind of a nice bell curve. And maybe I don't need to touch it so much for this particular image. So before I touch the whites and the blacks, I like to see where I can pull the highlights. This is over here. And as you see when I'm dragging this, the histogram moves. So if you go back, there's a little bit more contrast. Now I like to avoid touching the contrast because I want to add the contrast with the highlights, shadows, blacks, and whites first. And that seems to be a bit muddy. I might even take my blacks over, but not too much. You don't want it to be like this. I like to say take it to the very end and edge back. There's a few little dots, I'm okay. And sometimes with the whites, let's actually take it to the very end and edge back. So you can see we have made quite a difference. It's kind of sharp, so I might actually take the highlights back a little. And what's really cool is you have this Y and these other things. So this can give us a comparison of where you started off and where you're at now. You can flip back and forth. And you can even kind of see, I like this, just to check to see where I came from. And I didn't even have to touch the exposure. Now, I like to do this with black and white because color can really change how we do this. So I'm going to change this back to color. As you can see, we've got a nice full range. We've got shadows, highlights going on. All right, so the next is we're going to look at the white balance. Now, you should be shooting for your first assignment in auto. Let it decide for you. But if you and we'll talk more about white balance and how to adjust it later. But we're going to kind of play around with the temperature, whether it's cold or warm. Cold being blue, warm being yellow. So I like to look for a good neutral and just play around. So try to think about what would be the best. So the boat's probably white, not yellow. So I'm just going to kind of move it over. And I can even zoom in if I want to get that detail. Oh, that's too much. Doing a command negative, command plus, and I can do H for my hand to kind of move around. I'm looking at the buoys, making sure they're not too yellow. But we don't want it to be too cold of an image. And we can play around with that. So below, so we played around with this. I didn't even touch contrast. I usually try to leave contrast later. I might add a little to the shadows. Maybe not too much, because there's not so much shadow in this particular image. If you chose a different one, then there would be more edits. So down below we have clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. Dehaze is actually not on the PDF. This is a new thing they added. So clarity is kind of the tonal contrast. So we didn't touch the contrast. I always like to say, take things to the extreme and step back. So if I take it to the complete right, it looks kind of crunchy, like a crunchy picture. I might go fit in view. And you have your zoom in here. So it looks very crunchy. It's not super sharp. And if we take it all the way here, it looks kind of blurry. Kind of like a soap opera. So I always like to do 0, and I actually just like to pump this up just a hair. It's not, if my image should be sharp when I take it. This is just adding a little crispness to it. Dehaze, as you can see, this kind of gives a haze look. This sort of hazy look's really popular with the Instagrams. But I figure let's just kind of keep it as is. And there's vibrance and saturation. So saturation's really just for removing color and not adding it. So if we pull this up, if we add way too much, it looks very clowny and amateur, like it's too much. You can kind of have a desaturated image. It definitely changes the mood. This is sort of more of a somber photograph versus this is like, oh, it's very bright and cheery. But I usually don't use it to add color. Now there's vibrance, which is like smart saturation, so it does it with some math, but it makes dull colors more vibrant and doesn't really touch the already vibrant colors. So if we take the vibrance up, again, if it's a little cloudy, but all those duller colors, it kind of adds more of a vibrance to it. So we're going to there's some tabs here. The next one is the tonal curve. As you see, we have our histogram here, and this is a different way to make edits. It separates the areas of light, shadow, midtones, whites, and blacks. It's like curves in Photoshop. So you can use it to make your adjustments. So this is a little bit more advanced, but you can drag the highlights. So this would be the highlights right here: whites, highlights, midtones, shadows, and blacks. And as you can see, that correlates with the histogram, where if you were to take all your pixels, line them up, it would be black, 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 gray, 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 like gray, like gray, like gray, white. So you can kind of, this you can't really click, but you can move this here. You can see it doesn't do much, but you can adjust your highlights there, just to adjust them there. Maybe your lights and your shadows. You don't want to lose too much detail when playing around. There's other information there's detail, HSL, split toning, lens corrections, effects, calibration, presets, and snapshots. So some of that's a little bit more in depth that we're going to get into. We're just touching it today, and we'll talk more about it later. So we're going to talk about the adjustment brush. So these are global edits. They edit everything in the program. Local edits are for very specific things. So if you look up here, we have our little brush. We're going to click on it. And these are how we're going to make our adjustments. And it's just like using the brush tool in Photoshop. And there's new, add, erase. And we can adjust the size of our brush. So the size of it is the diameter, the brush tip in pixels. Feather is how hardness it is. So if it's 100, it's going to be very sharp edge. 0, it's going to be very soft. Flow is the rate of application of the adjustment. Density, the transparency of the stroke. And this is in the PDF. But you'd say we want to add some shadows here. And this is just kind of and it's got a color so I know where I'm brushing. And I'm just kind of playing around over here. And I can actually and I like this just so I know where I'm putting like my pixels. But you can say, I want this to have more shadows. And I'll just play around with it. It definitely added that color, so I'm just going to step back. But you can play around with that. And then there's a graduated filter. So let's say we want to play around with this. As you can see. So it works as a gradient. This is helpful for skies. It gives us sort of a darker sky that's kind of more ominous. You can play around with those adjustments and play around with it. So let's say you've done your edits, and if you don't like, you can do a Command Z and play around. And let's say we're ready to go. So you're going to click Open Image. Done kind of saves it as an XML file so you can edit around later. But I always say let's open it up. And we're going to open up Adobe Photoshop, which will be the next tutorial. And I'll see you for that one.